Alright, hi guys. Today we're going to do the last section, which is 5.6, which is phase shift and sinusoidal curve fitting. So we are going to use our calculator later on, so if you don't have it, go ahead, pause the video, and go ahead and grab your calculator. Alright, so for this first section, it's pretty much what we've been doing before. It's just adding a phase shift, which is left and right, and just analyzing what that looks like, but it should be very similar. So we're going to graph the first one, and then we're just going to analyze the second one. So the first one says find the amplitude, period, and phase shift of 3 sine of 2x minus pi and graph the function. So first, the amplitude, we remember, is just my number in front. So my amplitude is going to be 3. Now the period, remember for sine and cosine, it's going to start with 2 pi. This is my period, but then I have to divide it by whatever number's in front. So my period here is just going to be pi. Now, here's where it gets a little bit tricky for your phase shift. This 2 is the number that's technically in front of both x and negative pi, so I have to factor that out. So x minus pi over 2. Okay, so you have to factor out that 2. So make sure that you factor that out when you take into account if it's going left or right. So this is minus, so that means it's going to go right pi over 2, and that's going to be what we call our phase shift. Phase shift is just left or right. So again, make sure if you have a number in front of your x that you factor that out. Okay, now let's go ahead and graph it. So remember your period will go on the fourth line, so that's pi. So that'll be pi over 4, pi over 2, 3 pi over 4, and then pi. Negative pi, negative 3 pi over 4, negative pi over 2, and negative pi over 4. I know my amplitude is going to be 3, and then down to negative 3. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and graph it with an amplitude of 3, and then I'll go back and I'll do the phase shift of right pi over 2. So sine is going to start at my origin. Oops, 1, 2, 3. So that is the sine graph with an amplitude of 3. Alright, so then for your final graph, you have to shift it right pi over 2, and that means that's 2 tick marks on this graph. So each one is going to go right 2 tick marks. Notice for your x-intercepts, it's going to end up being exactly the same. And I'm going to denote that my blue is my final. Okay? And so that's what the phase shift will look like. Alright, so for this next one, I'm not going to graph it, but I am going to go ahead and find the amplitude, period, and phase shift. So the amplitude for this one should be 2, because that's my number in front. For the period, I'm going to go ahead and factor out that 4, so x plus 3 pi over 4. So my period, remember, I have to take 2 pi over that number in front, which is 4. So my period is pi over 2. And then lastly, for my phase shift, now this one is positive, so that means it's going left, and then 3 pi over 4, after you factor out that 4. Okay? So one practice with graphing, and then one practice with just analyzing. Alright, so next page is the regression. So go ahead and pause the video and enter that into your L1 and L2, that data set. Alright, so hopefully you have that data entered into L1 and L2. Now this is just you're fitting a sine curve to this data. So this is going to be an L1 and L2. And then you're going to go to Stat, Calc, and you're going to find sine reg. And it's going to be letter C. Okay. Now it's going to give you a lot of information of like iterations and all of that stuff, but you can just leave everything blank and go down to calculate. Okay, and it'll give you your equation. So you have to be careful when you write it. It gives you a lot of like A, B, C, and D. So A, remember, stands for your amplitude, so that's going to be your number in front to 3 decimal places, 21.147. And then sine of, then we have our B value, which is 0.549, and we'll talk about in a second what all these would mean. X plus C, which is actually going to be negative. So minus 2.35 or 350, and then plus D, so plus 51.193. Okay, so my amplitude of this graph would be that 21.147. Now let's go ahead and find the period. So the period, we would start with 2 pi, and we would divide it by this number in front, which is 0.549. And I know that's obviously rounded, but let's go ahead and just do that. I get 11.445, and you should notice that that's pretty close to 12, okay? Because there's 12 months in a year, so it's going to repeat itself about every 12 months. So that makes sense, and I know obviously that was rounded as well. So if I factored that out, I could find my phase shift, and it's going to go up 51.193. We could also use this, I'm not going to go through this, but we could also use this if we put it into Y1 to, for example, predict, if I told you, let's say X equals 9, predict the temperature in September. Okay, so just like we've been doing with all of our regular regressions, it's not any different than what you would do there. Okay, you would have to store it in Y1 to get the exact value. Okay, so just like you can do regressions with any other function, you can also do it with trig functions. Okay, and that's how you do sine reg and also how you take into account phase shifts. That's all.